Yesterday you overheard our conversation, didn't you? My eldest son and his wife are returning home for the birth of their child. So I need you to relocate your belongings to the yard. Excuse me, but you can't have kids, and you don't assist with my son's work. The least you could do is clear some space. Besides, I'm paying $10,000 in rent, and this situation is becoming tiresome to manage. I've been living with my mother-in-law, but now she wants me out because my brother-in-law and his wife are returning. With my mother-in-law, brother-in-law, his wife, and my husband all in the house, it's becoming too crowded. I've been trying to keep things running smoothly, but it's turning into a hassle. I'm done pondering about it. All right, I'll leave, but I can't just leave my belongings in the yard. I'll come back later to collect them. You're leaving? Thank you, that's a big help. Ignoring my mother-in-law's protests, I began packing my things and left the house within moments. 7 seconds after stepping out, I reached for my phone and dialed a junk removal service. Once I stopped contemplating, nothing could hinder my actions. I'm Linda, a 40-year-old ed consultant. My husband, Mark, also 40, manages 3 restaurants as a sole proprietor. Despite assumptions due to our age, we're newlyweds. Both workaholics, we tied the knot later in life. Marriage seemed unlikely for me until a chance encounter at a bar altered my perspective. As a regular at Mark's restaurant, we struck up conversations. Over time, our relationship evolved, and we began dating. 2 years later, we married. Moving into Mark's spacious house, which he shared with his 70-year-old mother, seemed practical at first. But living with my mother-in-law soon proved challenging, prompting regrets over my hasty acceptance. Inquiring about the necessity of such a large house, my husband revealed hopes of his older brother returning one day. Consequently, we rented a bigger house, though perhaps too large for our needs. Well, I got married and you came, so I guess it all worked out, I said as my husband unpacked my books, arranging them neatly on the shelf. With a smile, he shared stories about his brother Daniel, who seemed to drift from job to job. Despite Daniel's uncertain path, my husband harbored no ill will towards him. Don't talk about that kid. What if he really comes back? My mother-in-law's voice interrupted, appearing at the doorway, casting a shadow over what would soon be my office. It was evident she held a dim view of him, unlike my husband. It was understandable for a mother to harbor reservations about her eldest son's lack of responsibility. However, I couldn't shake the worry that someday my husband and mother-in-law might clash over Daniel. I'm not too fond of you either, Mom. Come on, we're going to live together now, so stop saying things like that. I intervened, hoping to diffuse any tension. She walked away with a soft padding sound of her slippers. I'm sorry. I'll talk to her, my husband offered. It's okay. I got a similar talk when we met for the wedding. I'll work on building a relationship with your mother as we live together, I assured him, placing a book on the shelf from his paused hands. It seemed my age, 40, was a sore point for my mother-in-law. While not impossible to have children at this age, it presented challenges. Daniel, Mark's elder brother, unmarried and childless, added to her disappointment. In her eyes, I failed to fulfill the traditional wife role, much like Daniel as the eldest son. Despite her initial coldness, our married life began. Her indifference towards me became apparent, but I resolved to build a relationship over time. However, Mark's struggles with his restaurants weighed heavily on my mind. Are you okay with your work? I asked, concerned. It's pretty bad. I need to take action soon, but it's tough to arrange the finances, Mark admitted, his head in his hands as we sat at the dining table. I abandoned the dishes to sit beside him, listening intently. As he expressed his worries, it became clear that our financial situation was dire. With prices soaring and expenses mounting, closure loomed over another store. You're Mark's wife, but you don't help out at the store. You just do your own job. Can you really say you're fulfilling your role as a wife? My mother-in-law's voice cut through the air from the living room, overhearing our conversation. I pondered what was going through her mind, but she had her own unique perspective. Mark had been navigating the restaurant business for nearly a decade, overcoming numerous obstacles along the way. I had faith that he would overcome this latest challenge as well. However, my harsh words pierced through the air. You, his wife, shouldn't be making that face. Are you trying to feed into his anxiety and make him fail? What a terrible wife. Her voice dripped with spite and venom, while her words stung. I couldn't deny that there was some truth to them. Instead of letting her words discourage me, I chose to take them as motivation to support Mark even more fervently. Flashing a reassuring smile at my worried husband, I resolved to stand by him through thick and thin. A year later, as my mother-in-law had predicted, Mark managed to turn the situation around and avoid closing another store. See, I told you, I said triumphantly, hoping to prove my worth to my mother-in-law. However, her response was far from supportive. A stupid wife who can't even trust her husband. Don't drag Mark down. Her words cut deep, but I tried to brush them off, considering it a small victory that Mark's business was thriving. But just when I thought things were balancing out, I received shocking news. Rumors of Mark's affair. My heart sank as I struggled to comprehend what was happening. How could he betray our marriage like this? As I grappled with this devastating revelation, Daniel, Mark's brother, called for him. It seemed Daniel's girlfriend was pregnant, and they were facing financial struggles. They asked if they could move in with us and work at Mark's restaurant. While I mulled over how to confront Mark about the affair, my mother-in-law swooped in, discussing Daniel's situation with him as if I weren't even there. It was a strange turn of events. She used to criticize Daniel for not living up to his responsibilities, yet now she was advocating for him, all for the sake of a grandchild. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as I watched Mark's troubled expression. It seemed he couldn't refuse his mother's request, even if it meant inviting more complications into our already tumultuous lives. I had hoped that Mark would stand up to his mother, but it seemed like wishful thinking. He kept glancing at me, likely concerned about my reaction. With the worsening relationship with my mother-in-law, Mark's affair, and now the prospect of living with Daniel and his family, the problems kept piling up. Overwhelmed and not knowing where to start, I decided to abandon my thoughts for the day and just go to sleep. The next day, being a holiday, and likely due to extreme mental fatigue, I slept in until late morning. With Mark at work, it was just my mother-in-law and me at home. Dreading what she might say about my late rising, I reluctantly headed to the living room. "You sure slept in. Must be nice to have such leisure," she said, surpassing my expectations. Then she brought up the conversation Mark and I had the day before. "Daniel and his wife are coming back for a maternity leave visit, so move your stuff out to the yard," she said bluntly. I was still groggy from sleep, wondering if she meant for me to live in the yard or to leave the house altogether. "You can't have kids anyway, and you don't help with Mark's work, so you should at least make room for Daniel and his family. We have 2 spare rooms left, so if you leave and your office is free, we can have a bedroom and a nursery for Daniel's family, and a storage room for their stuff. Don't you think the room count and usage are just perfect?" It became clear that she was indeed telling me to leave. Realizing that my mother-in-law now saw no reason for me to be in the house as a wife, since she could see her grandchild. And considering the hefty rent I was paying, I was too tired to deal with it all. Silent with my mother-in-law, the only sound in the living room was the ticking of the clock. "Okay, time to leave," I finally said, having rested my mind. I've decided it's too much trouble to worry about what happens to Mark, my mother-in-law, Daniel's family, and their future. I chose to leave the house. Without waiting for a response, I started packing my things and left the house. 7 seconds after stepping out the door, I took out my phone and called a junk removal service. My decision, made after stopping my overthinking, couldn't be stopped by anyone. Having left the house, I decided to stay at a hotel for the time being. I had called the junk removal service, but they needed some time to prepare. This worked out as it gave me a chance to clear my head and plan my next move. After leaving, I wanted some time to myself. 2 weeks later, I rented an apartment and started living alone. I hadn't heard from Mark since then. He probably assumed I'd eventually come back. The thought of Mark taking the situation lightly infuriated me. However, today was different. It was the day after his restaurant's date off, and I expected a call from Mark when he visited the restaurant for lunch prep. "Hey, what's going on here? The restaurant is completely empty," Mark exclaimed over the phone. Just as I thought, I chuckled. "Mark, I could explain over the phone, but it would be more efficient if your mom was there too. I'm heading to the house now. Can you come back? You can open the restaurant anyway, right?" Unable to contain my amusement at Mark's reaction, I hung up and started getting ready to leave. Upon arriving at the house, my mother-in-law immediately started yelling at me. It seemed Mark had only explained half of the situation. An unfamiliar couple was in the living room, apparently Daniel and his wife. They looked confused and anxious, not fully understanding the situation or my mother-in-law's extreme anger. "Why would you do such a thing? The restaurant can't operate now," my mother-in-law scolded. "It's my restaurant, so there shouldn't be a problem with me starting the closing process or having the items I bought disposed of by a junk removal service, right?" I countered. "Huh? Your restaurant? What are you talking about? Why don't you explain, Mark? You haven't told your mom, have you?" my mother-in-law questioned. Mark began to explain, looking uncomfortable. Seeing that we were getting nowhere, I decided to clarify. Before turning 40, I was single and working in ad consulting. We didn't have a wedding ceremony, nor did we buy a new house after getting married, so I had saved up quite a bit of money. I lent Mark $200,000 to help turn around his struggling second restaurant branch. $200,000? But you can't just hand over such a large amount of money to your spouse, right? My mother-in-law interjected. "That's why I decided to buy the rights to the second branch and become its owner," I explained. I left most of the management to Mark, so there wasn't much for me to do as the owner. The only change was that Mark shifted his focus from the main branch to the second one for its recovery when Mark's restaurant was in crisis. I felt it was imperative to show my support alongside Mark. It was when my mother-in-law scolded me for not displaying enough trust in my husband that I made the decision to back Mark wholeheartedly. My form of support came in the form of the money I had saved during my single years. "Mark, is this true?" my mother-in-law asked, her tone tinged with disbelief. "Yeah, it's true," Mark confirmed. "She said it was okay if I failed and wasted the $200,000. She gave me the money, but since it was such a large amount, if it was going to fail anyway, she suggested becoming the owner. The plan was to pay back the borrowed $200,000 from the restaurant's earnings, but it was simpler for Linda to become the owner and have the restaurant's income go directly to her. It also meant that she could decide whether to close the restaurant or not." "That's a lie." "Can something like that really happen?" my mother-in-law exclaimed. Understanding her skepticism, I decided to provide some evidence. I spread documents like the business license transfer of rights agreement and lease agreement on the table, proving that I was the owner of the restaurant. My mother-in-law's face turned red as she confirmed my name on those documents. "Why didn't you say anything about this? You always talked about how you believed in Mark and how the restaurant was recovering, right?" she demanded. "Even before we got married, you always encouraged Mark like that. He felt pressured by your words but tried to live up to your expectations. Not wanting to disappoint you as the head of the household, he's pretty cold to people like me and Daniel who don't fulfill their roles, right? That's why Mark couldn't tell you he borrowed a large sum of money from me. He could have just told me," I explained. "Mom, Linda, I'm sorry. This situation is my fault for not being decisive enough. If I had managed the restaurant well from the start, Linda wouldn't have had to lend me money. And if I wasn't such a weakling, I could have told you the truth," Mark interjected. Mark and my mother-in-law apologized, and it seemed as if everything was resolving nicely. However, I wasn't satisfied, and the discussion was far from over. "That's a misunderstanding. I'm far from being satisfied, and the discussion is far from over. Let's settle this matter next," I declared, handing Mark divorce papers. "Why divorce? This is supposed to be a reconciliation, right?" Mark protested in shock. "Don't just assume we've reconciled. You might think it's a secret, but I know about your affair with the part-timer. All the part-time workers knew about it too," I said firmly, displaying an image on my smartphone. "Wait a minute. Closing the second branch and a divorce? What's going to happen to the rent for this place?" My mother-in-law's voice shook. I haven't mentioned that yet. I've been paying the entire rent of $10,000 a month for this house. Is that also true? I inquired, directing my gaze at Mark. His shoulders slumped, confirming the truth of my words. It's true. When the restaurant's revenue started falling, Linda started paying half of it. But as revenue continued to drop, the amount she had to cover increased. Eventually, I ended up paying it all, $10,000 a month. It's the same as my salary, so I paid all the rent. And Mark covered other living expenses like food and utilities. Mark explained, his voice tinged with resignation. So if Mark gets divorced and only has the main restaurant left, obviously living here won't be an option anymore, I stated matter-of-factly. The weight of my words seemed to deflate both Mark and my mother-in-law, as if they had just finished an exhausting boxing match. Daniel and his wife, now somewhat understanding the situation, hesitantly joined the conversation. What does that mean? We came back here and can't live here? Sorry, Daniel, I expressed sympathetically. Right now, I don't have the means to help you with a restaurant or a house. Come on, do something. We're having a baby. At least give me a job, Daniel pleaded desperately. We have enough part-time workers. In fact, we need to cut down on staff costs. Mark will work hard, so just wait a bit longer, I interjected, trying to maintain some sense of order. That's what I'm talking about. Stop saying things like that, Daniel, Mark protested, frustration evident in his voice. As the argument escalated, it became clear that the future was uncertain for everyone involved. Witnessing the brothers' dispute over their mother, the mother-child relationship also deteriorated. Now, Mark and his mother were living together reluctantly in a smaller apartment, hardly talking and creating an awkward atmosphere. After the divorce, I first dealt with closing down the restaurant. It was a bit of a hassle, but as the owner, it was my responsibility. However, the fridge, cooking equipment, tables, and chairs I had removed were fairly new, so I managed to sell them at a good price. Adding just a little more money allowed me to finish the restaurant's closure. Though it was a brief period, being a restaurant owner and handling its closure was an experience. I believe these experiences will be useful in my AI consulting work someday. I guess work suits me better than marriage. Convinced of this, I continue to work hard. Today, after the tumultuous events that unfolded, the conclusion of this saga brought a mix of resolution and uncertainty. The revelation of the true ownership of the restaurant, coupled with the exposure of Mark's affair, exposed the fractures in the family. The decision to close the second branch of the restaurant added a layer of financial stress and uncertainty about the future. Despite the apologies, it became clear that reconciling the strained relationships would be a complex and ongoing process. The introduction of divorce papers, a decisive move by Linda, added another layer of complexity to this situation. The betrayal of trust, both in the marriage and the business, became a pivotal point that left the characters grappling with the aftermath. As the fallout extended to Daniel and his family, the once close ties between the brothers strained, revealing the fragility of familial bonds under pressure. The uncertainty about living arrangements and financial stability left everyone involved facing an uncertain future. The emotional toll of the conflicts was palpable, as seen in the strained relationships and the awkward atmosphere that settled over the characters. In the end, the story leaves us with a sense of closure regarding the restaurant's closure and Linda's decision to end her marriage. However, it also leaves many questions unanswered about the characters' futures and whether they can rebuild their lives and relationships after the storm that shook the foundations of their family. The resolution, while bringing some clarity, marks the beginning of a new chapter for each character as they navigate the aftermath of the choices made and the consequences faced.